by Patrick Meighan. Performed by Kristen Holland. Emily Sage accepted the warming numbness that crept through her broken body. She understood what it meant and was no longer afraid. Her mind had found peace, and her body stopped fighting. Her muscles softened, her breath eased. She turned to her family, her favourite people, and tried to speak, but was too weak now. She managed to smile for them. They all looked so afraid. Will, her high school crush turned husband, knelt on the floor next to her, wiping her face with a washcloth. He was covered in blood. Sarah, their youngest, stood next to her father, one small hand on the couch where Emily lay, the other hugging a throw pillow to her chest. She was crying softly. Emily struggled to turn her hand out to her, and the little girl took it gently. Michael stood behind his sister. At 14, he was doing his best to mimic his father, trying to be brave for her, but Emily could still see the little boy she loved so much. He knelt down next to Sarah and put his hand over both of theirs. Emily felt the touch of her family and nothing else. The pain, the fear, it was all gone. Her body no longer mattered. All she felt now, what came over her in a powerful wave of brightness, was an awareness of love, unconditional and overwhelming. It was beyond anything she had ever felt. There were no words she could have found to describe it. She looked again to each of them, feeling that love pass through their touch. She closed her eyes and squeezed her little girl's hand. Everything became whiteness, bright and welcoming. She existed in their love, becoming a part of it, letting it flow between her and them and everything. She would live now in this place of bliss, and she would wait for them to join her. Emily's body became empty. Her final breath left softly and her body sagged. Her hand went limp in Sarah's grasp. "No." Sarah's voice was a whisper. Michael took their mother's hand from her and gently placed it back on the couch. Sarah began to sob. Will took the little girl's hand and she collapsed into him, throwing her arms around his neck. Michael, still trying to be strong, looked to his father, unsure what to do. Will held out a hand to his son, and Michael rushed in, holding his father and sister, crying into Will's shoulder. Will held them tightly. He was alone now, the only one left to protect them. At least Emily was safe now. It had been a foolish plan, born of panic and a hope that there was some place safe to run to beyond their little town. They thought they had figured out a pattern, a time when their neighbours, the monsters they had become, were less active. So earlier that morning they had loaded up the SUV and tried to sneak out to the highway. They hadn't made it 3 blocks when Al Friedman's service truck burst from a blind driveway, blasting into their passenger side. Emily's side. Safety glass exploded through the SUV as it careened hard off the truck's push bar and slid across the road in a scream of squealing tires and roaring engines. The SUV slewed over a driveway and bucked hard as it dug into the freshly sodded lawn of Joe and Clara Miller's house. Will's hand slipped over the steering wheel and he pitched forward, then sideways, stunning himself when he clocked his head on the doorpost before the SUV finally came to rest. Will had been dazed, but he shook the ringing from his head and forced his eyes to focus. He turned to the back seats first. Sarah was crying out of fear, but not injured. Michael stared back at him, wide-eyed but also unhurt. He turned to Emily. She was unconscious, slumped over her safety belt, blood streaming down her face. Her body hitched as she struggled for breath. Will got himself up in his seat and leaned over her, gently putting her head back against the headrest, calling her name. He touched her face softly. She didn't respond. Then, suddenly, Sarah's crying stopped. Michael's voice came from the back seat, just above a whisper. "Dad, they're here." Will looked up past Emily, through what was left of the passenger side door, and he froze. There must have been 20 of them, most of them people from town, people he used to know. He didn't know them anymore. They had changed, become monsters. A week ago, this had been just another sleepy town where people raised their families, went to Little League games, and talked about the weather. Then the news reports appeared about the vicious attacks. People killing their families, neighbors saying the nice man next door had seemed ill, until he took an axe to the paper boy. The power went out on the third day, and the news stopped. The phone service went too, and the town, maybe the whole world, went dark. Paranoia set in as one by one people got sick, their bodies began to decompose, and they became something else. Something evil that lived inside those dead bodies. Will watched them gather together in the street beyond the ruined SUV, watching him, their bodies in varying states of decay. A rotting boy on a bicycle rode up to the scene and stopped next to the others. Will took the shotgun out from where he had wedged it between the seats and handed it back to Michael. "We're going back to the house. I'll have to carry your mother." Michael took the gun. His hand was shaking. Will put his hand over Michael's. "You can do this." Will got out of the wrecked SUV. Michael and Sarah stayed as close to him as they could get. He removed his wife as gently as he could and carried her. The children walked on either side of him. Sarah kept one hand on his belt. The dead people followed them all the way home. And now, kneeling on the floor next to his wife's body, holding their children, Will knew they were still out there. He tried to stand. Michael let go reluctantly and wiped his eyes, pulling himself together. Sarah squeezed harder, forcing Will to pick her up as he stood and walked to the front window. He held her head to his chest so she wouldn't see outside. There wasn't as many of them now. Across the street in the little park where he would often spend afternoons with Sarah, 3 dead people had settled into the old swing set. They swayed idly in the strapped seats, their feet dragging in the sand, keeping watch. Will didn't recognize them, but he knew whoever they once were no longer existed. Their flesh had turned a chalky purple color, and their eyes were milky. Next door, leaning on the 4-foot post and rail fence they had built together, was what used to be Tommy Wilkes. What Tommy was now had slaughtered his own family 2 days ago when his wife noticed he didn't look well. The Tommy thing lifted one hand and waved to Will, smiling. His clothes still covered in gore. Will held Sarah's head close. From behind him, Michael spoke. "We have to bury her." Will turned to the boy, and Sarah lifted her head from his shoulder, wiping her eyes and looking to her brother. "We have to, Dad." Michael had pulled a blanket over Emily and stood beside her now, stone-faced. "We have to." Will put Sarah down and she stepped toward her brother, then turned back to Will, speaking softly. "We could put her in the garden. She would like that." Will went back to the window. The creatures were still out there, watching. He tried to think of a way out. Everyone they had known here, everyone left, was one of those things. Will didn't know if there was even any place left to run to. Michael came up beside him. "They haven't attacked us yet. Maybe they'll just leave us alone." Will looked out to the garden Emily had planted. It was 4 feet wide and ran along the street line. Specimen plants and large stones formed focus points and were highlighted with freshly planted marigolds. A line of violet salvia bordered the grass. In the middle was a large area of freshly turned topsoil Emily had planned to use for a display of colourful annuals. It would be perfect. "Stay inside with your sister." Neither of them turned from the window as he spoke. "If anything happens, get to the basement." Will looked over at the Tommy thing. Michael was right. They hadn't attacked, but they had shown they wouldn't let them leave. Will had no idea what would happen next, so he decided he could only do what was important for them right now. "Maybe you're right. They'll probably leave me alone." Michael looked up to his father. "We have to do it together." Will looked away from the garden, turning to his boy, seeing his determination. He looked to Sarah, her eyes still glassy from tears. She nodded silently, agreeing with her brother. Will looked back to Michael, deciding. "I'll go out first, get a spot ready, then we'll do it together." Michael's face was hard, but he gave in. "Okay." They went out to the garage together. The children watched silently as Will took a shovel and pickaxe down from wall hooks. He gave the shotgun to Michael, then grabbed the manual release for the garage door, swinging it up and open, then stepping back quickly with the shovel raised for defense. Michael stepped up next to him, shotgun raised. They waited. Nothing happened. Will walked to the edge of the garage and peered around the corner. Nothing. He grabbed the pickaxe and stepped outside into the driveway. The 3 dead people in the park were still there. Tommy Wilkes, leaning on the fence, grinned widely, his drying flesh cracking around his mouth. Will turned back to his children. They were standing at the door to the house. Will lied to them. "It looks okay," then swung the garage door down before he could change his mind. He stood facing the garage door a moment longer, gathering his courage. Then he turned and crossed the lawn to the garden, dropping the pickaxe down and stepping over the salvia border into the turned soil where he would bury his wife. He set the shovel blade into the soft topsoil layer and looked over to the Tommy thing. It stared back at him, a line of bloody drool running over its lower lip. Will slammed his foot into the top of the shovel's blade and began digging his wife's grave. The Tommy thing laughed. For over an hour, Will alternated between pick and shovel, keeping an eye on the creatures around him, and pausing only to look back to the house where Michael and Sarah stood at the window. When he was done, he had a hole about 3 feet deep and a small pile of larger stones set to one side to be used as a marker. It was the best grave he could make for Emily. He put the shovel aside and walked back toward the house, looking to Michael in the window and pointing to the front door. Michael disappeared and moments later opened the door on the front porch. Will entered without a word, closing the door behind him and standing quietly in the foyer. Michael was at his side, clutching the shotgun. Sarah stood in the doorway to the living room, Emily's covered body behind her on the sofa. The children watched him, waiting for direction. Will wanted to find the words to tell his children it would all be okay. It would get better. But how? Where were they going to go? What was left? He looked to Emily's form under the blanket and steeled himself. Just this one thing. Right now there was only this one thing. He went to the couch and removed the blanket from Emily. Despite everything, he thought she looked beautiful, glowing. He picked her up and walked back to the front door. Michael opened it and moved aside as Will stepped awkwardly through the doorway with Emily and out onto the porch. He paused a moment. "Mike, you and Sarah stay here. I'm going to take your mother outside to the garden. Wait until I say it's okay, then you both come out together." There was silence behind him. "You with me, Mike?" Michael spotted. Yes, I got it." "Stay by the door. Keep Sarah safe." Will crossed the porch and went down the steps to the walkway. The Tommy thing had left the fence and gone up to its own porch, where it sat on the top step, picking at the dead flesh of its hands. It raised its head as Will came out, then went back to peeling grey skin from its palm. Will crossed the lawn to the garden grave, kneeling as gently as he could, and lowered Emily into the ground. He straightened her ruined clothes, pushed the hair back from her face. "I love you so much, Em." He held back his tears. "I'll do my best to keep them safe. I promise I will." He paused a moment longer before he stood and turned away, walking back to the house to get their children. He stopped at the walkway, checking on the creatures again before waving to Michael for them to come outside. He turned as Michael opened the door, watching the things across the street, keeping an eye on Tommy. He heard the front door slam and cringed. Tommy stood. Mike came up next to Will, Without taking his eyes from the creatures, Will held out his hand. "Give me the gun, Mike." Michael put it in his hand, and Will quickly checked it, pushing the safety off. He turned to the kids. "Okay, we're just going to—" Sarah wasn't there. Will spun back to the house. "Sarah!" He turned on Michael. The boy started panicking. "I thought she was right behind me." Will grabbed Michael by the arm. "Stay with me!" and bolted back up the walk to the house. He had reached the porch steps when the front door opened and Sarah rushed out. She held a framed picture of the family out in front of her.
"It's for Mommy, so she can always remember us."
Will let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and released his grip on Michael. He looked down to the photo. It had been taken last fall, all of them together, standing in a pumpkin patch. They each held a tiny pumpkin, except Sarah, who held a giant one, her little face peering out around it. They were all smiling. "I think she would like that." He held out a hand for the little girl. "Let's go, quickly now." He turned, and as his daughter stepped off the porch, the creatures saw her. The three in the park sprang from the swings and came up to the opposite curb line. The Tommy thing leapt off his porch and jogged awkwardly back to the fence, its face twisted in some manic glee. Will shouldered the shotgun. Sarah and Mike froze. The Tommy thing stopped short at the fence and Will held fast, keeping the gun on Tommy. Across the street, one of the creatures stepped tentatively off the curb, its teeth bared. Will turned the gun in its direction and it stopped. The Tommy thing lifted a leg up over the fence and Will swung the gun back to him. The other two creatures stepped into the street. A siren wailed. They all stopped, startled, and turned in its direction. Several houses down sat Sheriff Foster's cruiser. It had arrived unnoticed and was stopped in the middle of the street, the glare of the sun obscuring the driver. Will turned back to the creatures. They all remained still, watching the patrol car. The three across the street slowly turned their attention back to Will. One of them took another step toward him, and the car's turret lights came on. The creature paused, looking back to the car, then again to Will. The cruiser revved its engine. No one moved. Suddenly, the three in the street turned and went back into the park. The Tommy thing let out an angry cry and climbed off the fence, storming back to the house. It paused on the porch, glaring up the street at the sheriff's car. The engine revved again, and the Tommy thing went inside, slamming the door behind it. Will lowered his gun. The turret light stopped spinning and went dark. Michael stepped up next to Will, one hand shading his eyes, trying to see the driver.
"Is that Sheriff Foster?"
Will stared into the car. He could just make out a shape behind the wheel. He caught a glint of sunglasses. "I don't think so." He took Sarah's hand. "Let's go say goodbye to your mother," and led them across the lawn. The cruiser didn't move. As they came to the garden, Will took a knee between his children and paused, holding them close. "She loved you both so much." Sarah stepped forward and leaned down, placing the picture in the ground next to Emily. She stood and then quickly turned, rushing back to her father, squeezing him hard around the neck.
"Will we see her again when we die?"
Will held the little girl, wondering when that might be. "Of course we will. We'll always be together." Michael knelt next to his father and reached down into the grave to take Emily's hand. He closed his eyes and began a soft prayer. Will took the boy's free hand and prayed with him. The police engine growled. Will turned to the sheriff's car as Michael finished his prayer. The boy opened his eyes and they both watched as the cruiser began driving toward them. Will reached down for the shotgun, then stood, still holding Sarah, and stepped back from the garden. Michael fell back next to his father. The sheriff's car continued, slow enough to hear the loose gravel grind and pop beneath its tires. It stopped directly in front of them. Will set Sarah down behind him, putting both hands on the gun. "Michael, watch your sister." Michael stepped back behind his father and took Sarah's hand. The car idled in the street. What was once Sheriff Foster sat behind the wheel, staring forward. Will adjusted his grip on the shotgun. The sheriff thing reached up and turned the rearview mirror so he could adjust his sunglasses. Then he righted the mirror and returned his hands to the steering wheel. He looked over to the park at the other creatures, then reached down and cut the rumbling engine off. The door swung open. The sheriff rose up out of the car. He still had not looked at Will and the children. He adjusted his gun belt, straightened his tie, then reached back into the cruiser and retrieved his campaign hat. He turned it slowly in his hands, brushing at a spot on the brim before squaring it atop his head. He closed the cruiser's door and turned to Will. There were dark stains on his uniform, and his flesh had begun to decay like the others. His face had gone a pale green. His ears were blackened. He stepped toward them and stopped at the curb line. Will could smell his rotting flesh.
"Hello, Will Sage."
His voice was a rasp. Will put the shotgun to his shoulder, leveling it at the creature. Sheriff Foster raised both hands and flashed a stained smile.
"If you only knew how useless that is."
The sheriff paused. His smile faded.
"I've only come to speak with you, Will. You won't need that."
Will continued staring over the gun barrel at the sheriff.
"Just a few words, Will."
The sheriff lowered his hands and turned back toward the park. The creatures there had moved closer.
"However, I think it would be best if you sent the children back inside. As you can see, they are distracting."
The sheriff went back to his car and turned, facing Will again. He leaned back on the fender, crossing his arms across his chest.
"I'll wait."
Will remained still a moment, his finger resting on the trigger, not sure what was happening. "Michael, let's go. Back to the house." Michael led Sarah, and Will walked slowly backwards, keeping the gun on the sheriff. He heard the door open behind him and turned to the house, taking the porch steps fast and going to the door. Sarah was already inside. Michael remained at the door. Will held the gun out to him. "Take your sister down to the basement and wait for me. Barricade the door like I showed you." Michael paused, looking past his father to the sheriff. Will pushed the gun into his chest. "I need you to do what I say, Michael." The boy looked back up at him. "Now take this and get your sister to the basement." "I'm going to finish in the garden. Then I'll come back and get you." Michael took the gun and stepped further into the house. He stared back out at Will. "It's okay, Mike, I won't be long." Will closed the door on his children and stood alone on the porch. He turned away and strode back out to the garden. He would finish burying his wife. Stepping over the salvia, he picked up the shovel and began filling the grave, throwing dirt on Emily's body. Sheriff Foster watched from his patrol car. Will worked with a rage. He wanted to attack the dead thing that was once Foster, wanted to bash its skull in and go after the others. He no longer cared about himself, but he knew he had to keep his head. He couldn't give up and risk leaving his children alone. He swung the shovel harder, trying to think of a way out, trying to ignore the sheriff. But as he worked, the dead people began to return. The Tommy thing came back outside to sit on the porch, and the creatures in the park came out to stand behind the sheriff's car. There were others too. Will saw them ambling down the street from either direction. Doors in the surrounding homes opened, and his dead neighbors came out. Will continued throwing down dirt. When he was done, he stacked the small pile of stones at the head of the grave and paused there. Sweat soaked his shirt, his breath still heavy as he knelt in the earth with one hand on the marker. He closed his eyes and went someplace better, thinking of the time he had with Emily, all the gifts of life they had shared, the love they had. He smiled. When he opened his eyes again, the sheriff was standing in the street next to him, a polished boot up on the curb. He leaned forward, one hand on his knee, the other on his holster.
"If it helps, Will, at least she escaped us."
Will was so tired now. Exhaustion had dulled his fear. He ran his hand along the stones of his wife's grave marker, then stood, taking the shovel from the ground as he rose. The sheriff straightened as Will stepped forward and planted the shovel into the ground between them. He put one foot on the shovel's blade. His head sagged as he rested his weight on the handle. You can't have them. He turned his head up to the sheriff. I won't let you, so you might as well.
You're one of the strong ones, Will.
The sheriff reached up and removed his mirrored glasses. His eyes were rheumy. The pupils had gone a dull white.
I would so like to eat your soul.
Will's body went taut, and he took a step back, dragging the shovel with him. The sheriff removed a small cloth from his shirt pocket and began cleaning the lenses of his glasses. Will looked to the restless mob of dead people, then back to the sheriff. What are you? The sheriff finished buffing his glasses, held them up for inspection, then slid them back over his rotting ears. He turned to the dead people from the park who had gathered behind his car. One of them, a teenager wearing an oversized sweatshirt with the high school emblem fading on the front, bared his teeth as he rocked impatiently next to the others. The sheriff turned back to Will.
I don't think there's enough time to explain it all, Will.
Will took another step back and raised the shovel out in front of him. The sheriff tucked the small piece of fabric back in his shirt pocket.
A hole in the universe is how we found this world. And nobody even knew we were here. We don't take the same.
He looked to the sky a moment, thinking.
Form as you, Will. No meat bodies.
Will narrowed his eyes, trying to understand. The sheriff continued.
When you look inside yourself, Will, when you really examine, you can identify your body, distinguish it from your mind. But there is that other presence you find, that part of you that is without body, free of ego. You may call it the soul. That's how we exist, Will. Like that.
He adjusted his gun belt.
And like all things, we need to eat. You see, Will, your soul, it's trapped in those bodies. And it's just food to us.
Will's eyes widened.
Ah,
the sheriff raised his hands out before him, smiling.
The spark of awareness.
He stood like that a moment, then lowered his hands. His smile faded.
Not so pleasant, is it, Will? To lose a place on the food chain. To become cattle.
The sheriff stepped up from the street and into the garden. He stopped at the foot of Emily's grave.
I do find your species interesting, Will. Your relationships, the choices you make. Of course, in the end, you're just a talking cow to me.
The sheriff looked over Will's shoulder to the house.
All of you.
Will raised the shovel and stepped to the sheriff. He got the blade up to within a few inches of his throat and stopped, holding it there, shaking with rage. The crowd of dead people stirred. I could stop you right now, Will spit his words. I could at least stop you. The sheriff didn't flinch.
Your friend, Will, the sheriff, he's still in here. I'm consuming his energy, but he can see all of this.
Will moved the blade closer.
If you destroy this body, Will, I will be set loose, and it's your body I'll take next.
The sheriff reached up and put his hand on the shovel blade, lowering it.
Where do you think I'll take your body?
He looked past Will again to the house.
Won't they be happy to see Daddy? Why, I'll bet they just rush into my arms. Then I'll make you watch what I do.
Stop it! Will backed away from the sheriff, holding the shovel out in front of him. I won't let you near them. I'll stop you! There was a ripple of spasmodic laughter through the crowd of dead people. The sheriff held up a hand, and they quieted. The sheriff stepped toward Will, removing the revolver from his holster and grasping the other end of the shovel Will held between them. The sheriff tugged lightly on the shovel. Will held on. The sheriff raised the gun to Will's chest.
You're no help to them dead, Will.
Will relaxed his grip and the sheriff gently took the shovel from him and stepped in, closer, the gun still raised.
Your wife, Will.
He looked down to the grave.
She escaped.
Will furrowed his brow.
When she died, her energy, her soul, left that body before we could consume it. She is free.
Will's features dulled. His shoulders sagged as the realization formed.
You can still save your children, Will.
The sheriff turned the revolver around, holding it out to him. Will stared at it numbly.
Take it. This is perhaps the most human offer I will give you.
Will reached out, taking the revolver. He held it in both hands, staring at it. He looked back up to the thing inside the sheriff, his eyes filling with tears, his hands shaking.
Why?
The thing inside the sheriff considered him a moment.
Move.